Hey guys, welcome back for another episode. Today's topic is how Russia uses ancient empire tactics to win the modern day propaganda war. Let's get into it. Now, when I start explaining to you, I want you to strip away one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about the modern Russian propaganda, that it's new, improvised, and purely a product of the internet age. It isn't what we're seeing today at all. It is the continuation of an imperial strategy that Russia has relied on for centuries, long before society, media, or television, or even mass literacy. Modern technology didn't create this system, it simply gave it speed and its reach. To understand how Russia fights its modern propaganda war, you have to understand how the empire taught it to rule through narrative before it ruled through force. Now, I'll begin with the medieval Muscovy because this is where the Russian state first learned that controlling meaning wasn't important to controlling territory. Muscovy emerged in a world defined by invasion, tribute, and survival, shaped heavily by centuries of Mongol domination. It's that environment, centralized authority that was not just efficient, it was necessary. Obedience meant survival, and chaos meant annihilation most of the time. From this reality, a political cue formed where the ruler's version of events was not simply opinion, it was protection. It was a state defined reality. It could keep danger at bay. From the very beginning, Russian expression had framed in a way that still defines it as propaganda. It was never described as a conquest. It was described as a restoration. Ivan III and Ivan IV did not claim they were building an empire. They claimed they were reuniting the lands that had been unjustly separated from their historical and spiritual countries. I'm sorry. Okay, if you convince people of history is on our side, you don't have to justify your actions in the present. Authority becomes inherited from the past, not earned through consent. Loyalty to the state becomes loyalty to history itself. To oppose the ruler is not just political disagreement, it's a betrayal of the destiny. These are the types of ways they think. As the system matures, something critical happens. Truth stops being treated as an objective reality, and it starts being treated as a stabilizing force. Information is no longer about accuracy, it's about the order. The stories that reinforce unity and obedience and continuity are elevated, and the stories that introduce doubt and fragmentation is an alternative future of suppression. This is not accidental censorship, it's a strategic design. The Russian state learns early that doubt is more dangerous than force because of doubt. Dissolves cohesion from the inside. This is the first ancient tactic that still defines modern Russian propaganda narrative. The preconditioning, I would say, before people are asked to support a war and an annexation or a crackdown, they are taught a worldwide or a world view where those actions already make sense to them. Expansion feels inevitable and resistance feels artificial. Enemies feel eternal. By the time a modern crisis arrives, the population has already been emotionally prepared to accept the state's explanation. I'm going to pause here because this is where modern audiences often misunderstand the propaganda what the propaganda is. I'm sorry. It isn't about lying all the time. It's about deciding which truths are allowed to matter. The Russian imperial system mastered this early. It didn't need to fabricate everything, it needed to frame everything. Context became more powerful than facts, and the interpretation became more important than the actual evidence. As the Russian state expanded, this mindset hardened into a worldview where the state did not simply govern people, it educated them in reality. The state defined who belonged and who was dangerous, and who was corrupting the natural order. Foreign influence was framed as contamination. Internal dissent was framed as a weakness exploited by the enemies. This is where the idea of the besieged fortress begins to take shape, even centuries before the formal articulated. This is the key point I want to carry forward. Modern Russian propaganda doesn't begin with persuasion, it begins with inheritance. In its activities, the ideas that have been culturally embedded over the generations when modern Russian leaders talked about historical unity and the sacred land, or being forced into conflict. They're not inventing excuses on the fly, they are reaching back into an imperial memory where power and history and morality are all fused together. This is how ancient empire tactics survive into the modern propaganda war. Not by repeating old words, but by preserving old assumptions. The assumption that the state embodies history is the assumption that expansion is defensive. The assumption that dissent is dangerous. Once those assumptions are accepted, modern propaganda doesn't have to work as hard at all. In the next part, I'm going to show you how this imperial mindset becomes sacred. How religion, destiny, and moral authority fused into the idea of Moscow as the third Rome, and why that belief still shapes Russian behavior in the modern world. Alright, now as we move into this part, I want you to understand the Russian power doesn't just rest in territory or military strength. It rests in moral positioning. One of the most powerful ancient tactics Russia still uses today is the belief that it's not merely a country, but a civilizational authority. This idea is not modern and it's not symbolic. It comes from a very specific historical moment when the religion and the empire and destiny fused into a single narrative that still shapes Russian propaganda today. The concept of Moscow as the third Rome, emerges after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, with Rome fallen centuries earlier and Constantinople conquered by the Ottomans, and the Russian elites begins to argue that Moscow is the last true center of Christianity and the moral order. Now, this belief is not just theological, it's political. If Moscow and the Third Rome, then Russian rulers are not just kings or czars. They are guardians of civilization itself, and they are guardians of civilization when their authority is not optional, it's ordained. I want you to really sit with that because the idea changes every time it creates a worldview where Russian power is no longer justified by constant borders or the law, but the destiny. The state becomes sacred, loyalty becomes moral duty, and opposition becomes not just political disagreement but spiritual corruption. Think about that. Once this belief takes hold, the state doesn't have to argue its case. It simply just has to remind people that they are supposed to be. This is where religion becomes a tool of an empire. Orthodoxy is not just faith, it becomes identity. To be the Russian is to belong to a moral civilization under threat from outside decay. Western Christianity, later Western secularism, as framed as fallen, corrupted, or soullessness. This framing survives every regime change. The language shifts, but the hierarchy remains. Russia stands with spiritual depth, sacrifice, and order. The West stands for dissidence, chaos, and moral rot. This is not abstract history. You can hear the exact framing today when modern Russian leaders speak about traditional values with family and faith and cultural survival. These are not random talking points, they are modern expressions of the third Rome logic. The message is simple, but powerful Russia does not just disagree with the West, it stands above it morally, and if Russia is morally superior, then its actions are automatically justified no matter how aggressive they appear. Another critical element of the Third Rome concept is the prominence. Rome fell, Constantinople fell. Moscow, according to the belief, must not fall. This creates an intense fear and internal weakness. Dissent's no longer just inconvenient, it's dangerous. Pluralism becomes fragmentation and independent thought becomes infiltration. When you hear Russian propaganda describe critics as traitors, foreign agents, or internal enemies, this is not exaggeration. It's the logical outcome of a worldview that equates unity with survival. What I want to understand is, though, this belief, it trains generations of people to see the state as internal of themselves as temporary. Individual suffering because acceptable, it serves a civilizational survival. Sacrifice becomes virtuous. Endurance becomes identity. This is why hardship is so early reframed to Russian propaganda as proof of their strength. If pain is meaningful, then criticism becomes weakness. This moral framing also explains why Russian propaganda is so focused on history, memory, and tradition. The past is not something to learn from, it's something to inherit. Let me repeat that again. The past is not something to learn from, it's something to inherit. If the state can convince people that they are part of an unbroken sacred story, then modern failures feel like temporary trials. Rather than systemic problems, history becomes installation against accountability. How would that be? I don't even see how they would think like this. And modern information. Oh shoot! I lost the camera. Okay. And modern information warfare, the third Rome idea functions as moral armor. It allows Russian messaging to dismiss external criticism as illegitimate, hostile, or corrupt by default. Human rights critics become attacks on culture. International law becomes Western domination, and the sanctions become persecution. Every response is filtered through the assumption that Russia is defending something ancient and righteous against something shallow and predatory. So basically, in a roundabout way, they're always the victim. This is why Russian propaganda so often sounds less like politics and more like a sermon. It doesn't just argue, it preaches. It doesn't just persuade, it condemns. And once a political conflict is framed as a moral crusade, compromise becomes betrayal. This framing is incredibly powerful, but incredibly dangerous. So when you hear modern Russian leaders talk about defending civilization, protecting values, or standing against the Western decay, understand that you're not hearing modern rhetoric. You're hearing the Third Rome speaking through modern language. This is an ancient empire, logic adapted to a digital age. In the next part, I'm going to show you how this sacred authority gets weaponized even further, how conquest is reframed as reunification, and how taking land becomes an act of historical correction rather than aggression. And we see this, for example, we see this today with the modern Russian and Ukraine war. They're taking back what they had in the Soviet Union, and they believe Ukraine is theirs. Building on the imperial mindset and moral authority, this part focuses on how Russia frames expansion now as conquest but as a reunification. The tactic has been used for centuries and it's still central to modern propaganda. From early Russian history, rulers described new territories as fragmented pieces of a single historical body. Expansion was presented as restoration, making resistance appear illegitimate. Lands once connected to Russia politically, culturally, and religiously were seen as a natural returning order of Russian rule. This framing psychologically primes people to accept intervention. Independence movements become anomalies. Foreign influence explains resistance, and local populations are recast as the victims needing protection. Modern Russian propaganda repeats these ideas, and Ukraine is portrayed as artificial, its borders historic mistakes, and its political choices externally exposed. History is weaponized, maps, timelines, and centuries of narratives which are compressed to make reunification seem inevitable. The resistance is framed to delaying history, and military action is presented as reluctant but necessary to preserving moral innocence. The tactic explains why modern Russian actions are justified internationally, internally, and historically. Correction rather than aggression. Borders are wounds to heal, and expansion is framed as duty, not ambition. As we go on in the next part, we will explore how this expansionist logic fosters a siege mentally, fear, paranoia, and the intervention of external enemies to maintain control of both home and abroad. Alrighty. When we talk about the Russian modern propaganda, I need you to understand something crucial. Fear is not a side effect of their messaging, it is an engine that drives it. One of the most enduring tactics from imperial times to the present is that it called the siege mentality for centuries. Russia has presented itself as constantly surrounded by enemies, perpetually threatened, and under siege. This isn't accidental. On rhetorical flourish, it is deliberate psychological conditioning designed to make people accept extraordinary measures and see the dissent or the betrayal. Looking back at the 19th century, you can see the roots of it clearly. Russian leaders were obsessed not just with armies, but with the ideas. Liberalism, nationalism, and constitutionalism were treated as existential threats. The Tsar Nicholas, I described Russia as fortress under siege from foreign influence and internal reformers. Newspapers, literature, and political thought that questioned the empire were censored or attacked. The implicit lessons for citizens was stark. Though it was hostile and only loyalty to the state ensured survival, fear became not just a tool, it became a civic virtue. But the siege mentality does more than highlighting existing threats, it invites them. Independent thinkers, journalists, activists, and reformers could all be framed as saboteurs or spies. The state's messaging cultivated paranoia, teaching people to distrust anyone or anything outside of official channels. When the population internalizes the idea that survival depends on obedience, they began policing themselves and each other. Dissent becomes morally wrong, not just politically dangerous. Now, this mentality, as it extends to conquered or contested regions, populations are told the world outside is hostile and only the state can protect them. Resistance is portrayed as treachery compliance, which is framed as hostile and the state can protect them. Resistance is portrayed as treachery compliance, which is framed as loyalty to civilization itself. The same approach appears in modern Russian messaging regarding Crimea or eastern Ukraine. These regions are depicted as endangered, needing protection from Western influence and threatened by internal betrayal. Historical grievances, cultural ties, and shared identity are leveraged to justify the intervention, while portraying logical populations as dependent or vulnerable. Fast forward to the modern era, and this mindset is amplified by technological, state controlled media, social networks, and automated amplification systems, which allow the Kremlin to saturate the information space with fear, suspicion, and uncertainty. NATO and the West, NGOs, and independent journalists are constantly framed as enemies, both external as well as internal. The messaging isn't subtle, it is relentless and emotionally charged. Citizens are preemptively conditioned to interpret minor events or existential threats so that when the state takes action, military, political, and economic, it feels necessary or even justified. This tactic works because it appeals to emotion rather than logic. Fear bypasses rational analysis, paranoia fosters cohesion. Among the loyal, while isolation, skeptics, ordinary hardships, military setbacks, and sanctions are reframed as attacks from encircling its enemies, reinforcing the siege narrative and making obedience feel like survival. The propaganda is this form blurs the lines between information and indoctrination. People are not just absorbing messages, they are immersed in a worldview where the state is the only reliable protector. The siege mentality also funds an inversion that is psychologically powerful. The state presents itself as the victim, even when actively aggressively the imperial Russia framed expansion as defensive, restoring a historical order and protecting Orthodox believers. Soviet leaders portrayed the West as a constant threat to socialism. Today, Russian messages cast NATO sanctions or criticism as attacks, while military interventions are portrayed as reluctant but necessary responses. By convincing citizens they are under attack, the state legitimizes extraordinary measures including territorial expansion, censorship, and repression. It is critical to understand that the siege mentality is not about reality, and it doesn't matter whether or not threats are real, exaggerated, or fabricated. What matters is that the people believe they exist, and that only the state can protect them. Fear becomes a mechanism of social control, shaping perception so that the citizens support policies they might otherwise reject. This tactic, enduring because its leverage is a fundamental human instinct. The need safety in the face of danger. The need of safety in the face of danger. When you channel that instinct at scale, you create a powerful foundation for obedience and loyalty. And finally, the siege mentality primes the population for a crisis and war. By normalizing the idea of being perpetually threatened, propaganda makes inability, aggression, and repression appear inevitable. Citizens are conditioned to see danger everywhere they go, so extraordinary measures feel ordinary. This is why Russian messaging can simultaneously justify territorial expansion, information warfare, and internal repression. It is all framed as a defense of survival and a moral responsibility. Understanding this mindset, this is a key concept to understanding why Russia acts the way it does today. In the next part, we will examine how the Soviet Union industrialized these techniques. I'm sorry, I don't even know what's wrong with my speech. creating a total propaganda system capable of manipulating the perception both domestically and internationally, and how those methods evolved into digital information warfare we see here today in the 21st century. All right, this is where propaganda becomes a total system. To understand the modern Russia, we cannot skip over the Soviet era because this is a time where the techniques we see today were industrialized and perfected. The Tsars had stories, moral authority, and a siege mentality, but the Soviet Union turned these concepts into a fully organized, highly systematic operation. It became a machine designed to shape perception at every level: domestic, international, and historical. This is where narrative becomes a weapon in of itself. Under Lenin, propaganda was no longer just persuasion, it was a strategic tool of statecraft. Lenin argued openly that controlling information was essential for maintaining this power and advancing the revolutionary goals. The early Soviet state prioritized education and literacy. It campaigns and media controlled to ensure that its citizens not only received information but internalized it, a particular worldview. The goal was psychological: to shape the way people think, feel, and react to the world, and this approach quickly escalated under Stalin. During Stalin's rule, propaganda became omnipresent and omnipotent. History was rewritten continuously to fit the needs of the state. Political enemies were erased from photographs, textbooks, as were altered, and past alliances were recast as betrayals. The population was consistently reminded that reality was not objective. It was whatever they said it was. This is a key lesson. The Soviets understood that truth could be subordinate to power and that the perception could be manipulated systematically to ensure obedience and legitimacy. The Soviet Union also pioneered active measures, a precursor to the digital era of disinformation campaigns we see today. These include spreading conspiracy theories abroad, creating front organizations, funding social movements in other countries, and amplifying societal divisions. Man, this is everything we're going through today if you guys sit and think about it. The purpose was not necessary to make foreign populations pro Soviet, it was to destabilize them and erode just in the institutions and create a moral ambiguity so that no external actor could claim unquestioned authority over global narratives. Sound familiar? Wow. These methods are essentially mirrored in modern Russian digital campaigns. At home, the state perfected moral inversion and emotional manipulation. Citizens were taught that their sacrifices were noble, that hardship was a proof of strength, and that external threats were always looming. Now, as Soviet propaganda framed the state as a defender to the people, even as it engaged in mass repression, the purges and systemic violence and the fear loyalty were entwined, creating a citizenry and learning to self-censor, self-police, internalizing the idea that their survival depended on obedience and that faith in the state narrative. Education, culture, and art became the additional tools of propaganda. Films, literature, and music were all harnessed to reinforce ideological concession. Historical narratives were selective, emphasized to cultivate patriotism and validate current policy. Generations were conditioned to see the state as morally upright, historically invitable, and chronically under that form of external forces. The pattern is unmistakable. The siege mentality and the moral authority and narrative framing discussed in the earlier parts were now operationalized with surgical precision. The Soviet approach also teaches us about adaptability. Propaganda was not a static, it evolved with political and social conditions. Enemy images were shifted depending on the context, sometimes the West, sometimes internal factions, and sometimes abstract imperialists, or the bourgeois element. By constantly redefining threats, the state trained citizens to interpret reality through a lens of suspicion and obedience. This adaptability is key to understanding why modern Russian messaging is so resilient. It can pivot quickly, exploiting fear, confusion, and a historical narrative simultaneously. Finally, the Soviets mastered the art of international projection. Information was exported to weaken enemies abroad while reinforcing loyalty at home. Psychological operations were combined with cultural media and diplomacy to create ambiguity and distrust in rival nations. This is a direct precursor to modern hybrid warfare, the use of a narrative as a weapon to destabilize societies and manipulate perceptions and exhibit division without necessarily engaging in an open conflict. Man, this is scary reading because it's almost every part of this is what we are literally living through, it seems like. The takeaway here is that the Soviet Union didn't invent Russian propaganda, they perfected it. It systematized it. They fused the historical precedent, moral authority, and emotional conditioning, as well as the technological methods, into a total and complete system. Today, Russian information, moral authority, emotional conditioning, today's Russian information strategies, digital campaigns, and disinformation networks and psychological operations are direct, descendants of this model adapted to the speed and scale of modern information environment. And the next part will explore how these strategies were applied internationally, and the Soviets called active measures and how they sought to fragment societies abroad long before social media ever existed. Now that we've seen how the Soviet Union perfected propaganda at home, and how they took it abroad, this is where the strategy moves from shaping domestic perception to manipulating global perception. When the Soviets called active measures, these are tactics that laid the foundation for the modern Russian information warfare. And understanding them is critical in seeing the continuity from Empire to Putin era digital campaigns. Active measures were never about simply convincing others the truth. The goal was disruption, confusion, and destabilization. If you look at the historical record, the Soviet state invested heavily in spreading disinformation abroad, forging documents, supporting front organizations, funding sympathetic political groups, as well as amplifying social divisions and exploiting racial, political, and economic tensions. It wasn't fractured consensus. This is why you'll notice the modern tactics often prioritize chaos over clarity, and confusion itself is a strategic advantage. For example, in the 1960s and 70s, Soviet intelligence forced letters and planted false reports to make it appear that Western governments were corrupt and oppressive. They supported activist groups that opposed nuclear weapons, but simultaneously spread rumors that the same activists were secretly working for the West. The objective was not consistency, it was to keep populations uncertain, suspicious, and divided. The principle carries over directly in today's digital disinformation campaign. Bots, take accounts, manipulative videos, and social media amplification, all which operate to create doubt, polarize communities, and to make people question the reliability of information. Another hallmark of these active measures was moral equivalence. Soviet propaganda didn't claim that the West was wholly evil. It claimed that both sides were equally corrupt and hypocritical. Um, that no society could be trusted, and that the world was fundamentally unstable. The tactic of nature's cynicism, it makes people feel that the truth is unknowable. Morality is subjective, and therefore the state of entity of controlling information can be trusted. When you see modern messaging portraying Western governance as descendant, oppressive, or morally bankrupt, while simultaneously exaggerating Russia's virtues, you are seeing the same logic applied adapted for a digital and globalized environment. Active measures were also highly adapted. The Soviets did not rely on a single approach. They analyzed their targets carefully, which continues were vulnerable or internal division, which narratives could resonate culturally or historically, which fault lines could be exploited. They understood that propaganda works that when it amplifies pre-existing tensions rather than inventing them from scratch. Modern Russian information, I'm sorry, campaigns are remarkably similar. They map social, political, and cultural fault lines, then deploy narratives that push these divisions to the surface. The message is subtle. Chaos and distrust are the objective, not the persuasion. At home, since the operations reinforced domestic control, citizens were trained to see the world as complex, dangerous, and deceitful, and to trust the state as the only reliable source of guidance. Abroad, they cultivated instability without openly declaring war. The brilliance of the approach is that the achieves strategic advantage without battlefield confrontation. Confusion, division, and fear became the force multipliers. This principle continues to underpin contemporary strategies in Ukraine, Europe, and beyond. And finally, it's essential to understand that the Soviet system made disinformation systematic and repeatable. Active measures were not random, they were planned, tested, and optimized. Lessons were learned from success and failures, creating a feedback top that redefined techniques over decades. Modern Russian campaigns are digital heirs of the system. They leverage technology to scale the influence operation at campaigns which are digital heirs of the system. They leverage technology to scale influence operations at unprecedented speed, but the undoing logic confuses, divides, destabilizes, and remains unchanged. And the next part will examine the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, exploring how the loss of narrative control and national humiliation shaped the environment which allowed Putin's synthesis of an empire, propaganda, and digital information warfare to emerge. To understand modern Russian propaganda, you need to understand the psychological shock of the 1990s. The collapse of the Soviet Union didn't just end a state, it shattered an entire worldview for centuries. Russians had been taught to see their country as morally superior, historically invitable, and under constant threat from outside forces. Suddenly, that framework was gone. The empire was gone, and moral authority seemed diminished. For many of the world appeared chaotic and humiliating. Imagine being raised to believe that invitability of Russian greatness, only to see your country shrink, your economy collapse, and the people plunge into poverty and uncertainty. This period of vulnerability created both fear and resentment, and it left a vacuum in the narrative that had long held the society together. Citizens no longer had clear story that made sense or suffering external threats for internal failures. And humans crave narratives. They crave meaning. Propaganda, when carefully deployed, thrives on this need. During the 1990s, Russia experimented with an open media environment, but it is fragmented, chaotic, and often sensationalist. Western ideas flooded in, often clashing with local culture and tradition. The result was disorientation. Many Russians felt alienated from the new political and economic systems imposed in the post-Soviet period. This uncertainty created fertile ground for the next generation of propaganda, the one that promised stability, national pride, and historical correction. The lessons from the Russian leaders were, in fact, clear. First, narrative control the essential. With a coherent story, populations became vulnerability and despair, resentment, and external influence. Second, humiliation is a tool, public perception of national weakness, rather real perceived, can be leveraged to justify assertive action. Both domestically and internationally, third, fear and instability are Third, the fear and instability are powerful motives. In an environment where institutions are fragile, the people are far more likely to accept strong centralized authority that promises protection and restoration. I'm doing good. Enter Vladimir Putin. The 1990s taught him and the emerging leaders that power depends as much on controlling belief as controlling territory. He observed that empire may have collapsed materially, but the psychological infrastructure, narrative, moral authority, and siege mentality could be repurposed. The population was primed. They remembered the glory of the past and the victories and the humiliation of recent losses and the constant threat of external interference. What they've lacked was a story that could unite them and make sense. To make sense of the contemporary Russian propaganda which would provide it. Alright, I'm sorry for that pause. The 90s also revealed a critical vulnerability of perception which shapes legitimacy. Russia's decline was not just measured in GDP and military strength, it was measured in respect, influence, and the belief of the state. International actors could undermine Russia not only with any sanctions or military pressure, but with the narrative. The lesson was not lost on Putin's strategists. It can control how the world and Russians themselves perceive their country. You can rebuild power without necessity, rebuilding an empire physically. From a psychological standpoint, the 1990s cemented the importance of combined fear, pride, and historical memory. Russia, we taught that hardship could be reframed as a strength, loss as injustice imposed by others, and sovereignty as moral imperative. These lessons became the backbone in the modern messaging portray the nation as wronged and morally superior, which are imperiled, and people will support policies that might otherwise react or reject. Finally, the collapse of the Soviet Union created a blueprint for modern hybrid warfare. If you can manipulate perception, amplify divisions, and control the narrative, you can protect power from beyond. Today's campaigns targeting domestic audiences, neighboring states, and the global opinion are the direct heirs of the lesson learned from the 90s. Humiliation is leverage, fear is the motivation, and historical narratives is ammunition. In the next part, we'll explore how Putin synthesized centuries of imperial logic, Soviet systemic propaganda, and 1990s lessons into a modern strategy and empire without borders and a narrative-driven power, and a digital age of information, of war designed to speed, reach, and psychologically impact. Now we arrive at the modern era where centuries of Russian imperial strategy and Soviet propaganda techniques of the 1990s lessons converge. Vladimir Putin's approach is not improvised, it is a result of deliberate synthesis. He inherited a society primed for fear, pride, and historical consequences. He had access to sophisticated propaganda toolkits shaped by decades of state practice, and he ruled in an era where technology could amplify everything exponentially. The result is a modern information war that blends the old and the new seamlessly. The first component is historical legitimacy. Putin's messaging consistently references the past, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, the Great Patriotic War, and the historical grievances against foreign powers. By doing this, he taps into a narrative that has been culturally reinforced for centuries. Expansion is framed as a historical correction, foreign criticism as president's interference, and domestic dissent as betrayed of long-standing national mission. History itself becomes a weapon. Second, moral authority is central. The Kremlin frames itself as the guardian of civilization, the values, and identity. Traditionalism, Orthodox faith, and the Russian culture are elevated as moral anchors. Modern identity, transnationalism, Orthodox faith, and Russian culture are elevated moral anchors of modern propaganda, which portrays the West for decadent, corrupt, and intrusive, creating a stark contrast that justifies defensive and assertive policies. Citizens are asked not to simply obey, but believe that supporting the state is a moral imperative. Third, the siege mentality persists now, amplified through digital technology and social media bots, coordinated campaigns, and state controlled outlets. Created 24/7 environment of fear and suspicion and confirmation of pre existing beliefs. NATO, the United States, Europe, and the NGOs are presented as existential threats. By making danger constant, the population is psychologically prepared to accept aggressive policy moves at making danger constant. The population is is at home and abroad. The strategy to normalize hostility and make extraordinary, um, shoot, it makes extraordinary, measures feel ordinary. Fourth, the active measures have gone digital. Modern campaigns target domestic and international audience simultaneously. Disinformation, false narratives, and historical revisionist manipulation, which are broadcast through multiple channels of television, online news, social media, and even entertainment. Messages are crafted to polarize, confuse, and demoralize opponents while reinforcing loyalty among the supporters. The objective is strategic advantage, not necessary persuasion, and the goal is to shape perception and exploit the division. Finally, this synthesis is adapted. The system responds quickly to events, reshaping narratives in real time. Crimea, Ukraine, Syria, and inheritance campaigns abroad are all framed differently depending on the context, but the underlying logic remains history, which validates action, and the state is morally correct and enemies are omnipresent. By combining historical narratives and moral authority, fear and digital amplification, of modern Russian propaganda operates with unprecedented speed, each psychological power. The key takeaway is that we see today is not a sudden innovation. It's the result of centuries of evolution from Muscovy's narrative control to the Third World moral framework to Soviet systemic propaganda to the lessons of post Soviet humiliation, now accelerated by technology. This synthesis allows Russia to project influence, manipulate perception, and justify aggressive actions without needing conventional legitimacy. And the next part will divide two concrete examples of the digital age information warfare and examining how social media bots and online networks are used to manipulate populations both home and abroad, and how centuries old tactics are deployed by the speed of the internet. Now that we understand the historical and ideological foundations, we can see how they manifest in the digital age. Modern Russian propaganda takes the centuries old playbook. Alrighty, I'm just going to start from the beginning all over again. We didn't get too far into it, so it shouldn't matter. But now that we understand the historical and ideological foundations, we can see how they manifest in the digital age. Modern Russian propaganda takes the centuries old playbook narrative, control, morality, authority, siege mentality, and active measures, and appeals at unprecedented speed and scale through digital technology. Social media bots and coordinated campaigns and its algorithmic amplification, which have made it possible to reach millions of people instantly and manipulate perception globally and create confusion and division faster than any empire could in the past. The first thing to understand is that the digital propaganda is not random noise. Every message, meme, video, or news article is crafted strategically. Historical narratives are reframed in modern consumption. Crimea is not occupied, it is reunited. Ukraine is not sovereign, it's artificial. The West is not critical, it is hostile. These messages reinforce the moral and historical logic we've been discussing for centuries. But now they travel on internet speed, reaching the domestic audiences, diaspora communities, and global populations simultaneously. Engagement inadvertently boosts extreme emotional and polarizing content. Fear and anger are a catalyst of emotional triggers that reinforce the siege mentality and make the users more receptive to state-aligned messages. Psychological manipulation, once limited to control media, now operate on a global decentralized scale. Another critical element is targeting modern campaigns, exploiting pro-existing social, political, and cultural fault. Lines of historical tensions, racial divisions, economic frustrations, and the ideological disagreements are leveraged into increased polarization. The mirror Soviet active measures, the goal is to not convert the audience to a single ideology, but to fragment and create doubt to weaken societal cohesion. When a population is divided and unsure whom to believe, the state automatically gains authority by being the stable source of guidance. Disinformation today includes real-time adaptation. When narratives fail, they pivot quickly. If a false story is debunked, a new one is introduced. Often the subtle modifications, this adequately mirrors the historical strategy of the Soviet Union. These enemies are stones are reframed to match evolving historical strategy, of course. Soviet Union threats, enemies, and stories are reframed to match evolving circumstances. Modern Russian digital operations are an accelerated version of the system's monitors. Reaction identifies vulnerabilities and adjusts narratives continuously, often using the data analytics to optimize its impact. Finally, it is crucial to recognize the dual audience. These campaigns are aimed by externally and internally abroad. They sow confusion, division, and mistrust, which destabilizing opponents without open conflict domestically. They reinforce the loyalty and the historical legitimacy and the perception that the state is both morally correct and constantly under threat. The lessons of Muscovy and the Third Rome, the Soviet Union, and the 90s are all present. Fear, moral authority, historical invitability, and narrative dominance are amplified through the technology, creating a propaganda system faster, broader, and more psychologically effective than ever before. The key takeaway here is that the digital disinformation is not new. It is an invention. It is a new tool applied to an old playbook. History, morality, fear, and manipulation converge in a system designed to speed and reach. Once you understand the continuity of modern Russian information campaigns, stop feeling random or chaotic. They become predictable, systemic, and disturbingly effective. And the next part will wrap it up by examining these combined strategies of historical narratives and moral authority, siege mentality, and digital amplification, which come together to create coherent modern Russian worldviews, and how that worldview shapes actions both at home as well as abroad. As we reach the final part of this deep dive, it's important to step back and see the full picture. What we're exploring over the previous sections is not a random series of events or a collection of disconnected tactics. From the earliest days of Muscovy through the Third Rome ideology and imperial expansionist mindset, the Soviet propaganda machine and the lessons of the 90s, and finally to the digital age, there is continuous threads. Russia's approach to power is built on a narrative of perception and psychological influence. Modern Russian strategy is synthesis of everything we've discussed: the historical legitimacy and moral authority and the siege mentality, the historical grievance and the ability to manipulate perception both domestically and internationally, and every policy and every campaign and every message is designed to reinforce a worldview there. Russia is historically justified, morally superior, constantly under threat, and therefore entitled to act aggressively when necessary. Understanding this continuity allows us to interpret modern events not as isolated crises, but as a part of a continuing long strategy. The worldview shapes behavior at every level. The domestically it conditions citizens to support the state, accept hardship, and then interpretate criticism and external meddling. Internationally, it allows Russia to manipulate narratives to exploit divisions and achieve strategic goals without needing traditional military conquest in every case. Digital technologies have amplified these tactics to scale unimaginable in earlier eras, but the underlying principle remains the same. History itself, is moral framing, and the psychology of fear are still central. If you step back, you can see that the modern Russian information warfare is so effective, it doesn't rely solely on lies. It relies on amplifying existing fears, historical memories, and society's divisions. It taps into centuries of cultural conditioning, moral authority, and the narrative of control, and it is remarkably adaptable. When old stories fail, they are reframed. When the old methods are insufficient, new technologies are deployed. This is why understanding history is essential for interpreting modern actions, which, because past is not past, it is actively shaping the present. And the final takeaway is clear: the Russian propaganda in all its forms, in the product of a long continuum, It is designed to control the perception, to make citizens and outsiders alike question what is true, and to the position Russia as historically justified, morally correct, and perpetually under threat. When you understand this, the patterns become predictable. The logic becomes visible, and the narratives that seem confusing, um, let me see, like, let's see. Russia is historically justified, morally correct, and perpetually under threat. When you understand this, the patterns become predictable, the logic becomes visible, and the narratives that seem confusing or contradictory suddenly make sense within the centuries long strategic framework. Thank you for watching, and please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video. Peace.